Hello and welcome to Game of Theories. My name is Hriday Ranjan. You're watching Film Companion South. This is a show where we are going to be discussing the final episode of Game of Thrones. The series has finally ended and it has brought about mixed reactions from people around the world. If you haven't watched the episode, please go ahead and watch it because there are going to be lots of spoilers. Alright, let's jump right into it. Bran Stark sits on the Iron Throne. That was a surprise to me. I had not read any of the spoilers or the leak scripts and stuff like that. So they managed to surprise me at least. Bran Stark as the king signifies the dawn of a new era, one that is governed by fairness and justice and not by sheer might. Which sounds nice, but to me personally it seemed a little lukewarm. Because Game of Thrones was never a show that relied on tropes like the victory of good over evil and stuff. But more than Bran himself, I like that the entire council consisted of first-timers and most unlikely first-timers. There was Sir Davos, who is a former smuggler. Then there was Sir Bronn, who is a former sellsword. And there was Samwell Tarly, a former prince who was sent to the Night Watch and is now a maester. I was surprised online to see that a lot of people expected Jon Snow to take the Iron Throne, which honestly would have been too out of character for him. Because all through the seasons he's been saying, I don't want this, I don't want that, I don't want anything. It would have been weird if in the final episode he said, oh, Iron Throne, yep, I want. Bran Stark was made the king and a lot of people were disappointed by this because honestly he has been pretty underused through the last few seasons. But if you look at it from his point of view, it was probably redemption and completion of a full arc. Because the first ever episode ended with him falling from a tower and becoming a cripple. And the final episode ended with him as the king of the Six Kingdoms. The entire series can be seen as the journey of the Stark children because season 1 begins in Winterfell with the Stark children and season 8 ends with them. In fact, the Stark children are the only characters that get proper arcs from start to finish. If you remember, Sansa in season 1 was a girl who was obsessed with dolls and sewing. She wanted to grow up and become a princess. She ends up as the queen of Winterfell. Arya never wanted to be a lady, she wanted to fight and she wanted to travel. She ends up as a fighter come explorer. Then there is Bran Stark, who in season 1 becomes a cripple. But by the end of the series, he ends up with the ability to travel to any place he wants. And finally, there is Jon Snow, who in season 1 craves the affection of Ned Stark, but is sent away to the wall. He ends up as the person in the Seven Kingdoms whose word is taken as the truth. In other words, a true successor to Ned Stark. The death of Daenerys was honestly on expected lines, and that is where the show suffered quite a bit because the interaction between the main leads was honestly lukewarm. The death of Daenerys was almost predictable by the end, and you could see the exact moment when Jon Snow decides to kill her, when she says that the people do not get to choose. The melting of the Iron Throne was a nice touch to signify the beginning of a new era. So what did I think of the final episode? Honestly, I was quite disappointed. Because Game of Thrones is a series that for a decade has continued to surprise people, it is sad that the final episode was so predictable. For the most awaited grand finale on television ever, this particular episode had a lack of urgency. Now, final episodes can be tricky. Earlier global phenomena like the show Lost also had a lot of disappointed fans by the end. In this particular episode, the fan service stuck out like a sore thumb. For example, the meta-referencing of Samwell writing the Song of Ice and Fire or fan favorite Podrick making an appearance, these just didn't click and the jokes didn't land. Honestly, the writers had put themselves in a tight spot by the end of this season. So, what really went wrong in season 8 of Game of Thrones? Personally, I think it was because of a fundamental clash between the two forms. One is that of the fantasy novel on which the series is based, and the other being primetime television. The series is now too far away from the books, and you can see the lack of everything that drew you to Game of Thrones in the first place. For example, the battles, the razor-sharp dialogues, the spectacular deaths, all of them seem to be missing by the end. Also, there was no justification for why there were only 6 episodes in this season, whereas 2 more episodes would have probably helped the writers ease through the major plot points. For example, the heel turn by Daenerys. Finally, and this is the most important point, for a show that sets such high standards of filmmaking, to notice rookie mistakes like the Starbucks cup or in the last episode the water bottles was really frustrating. It is almost as if the show was happily cruising along and suddenly it was asked to land at the nearest airport. Now this season was criticized quite a bit, but amidst all the criticism, we forget that overall it was quite a great show. So what is going to be the legacy of Game of Thrones? For one, before Game of Thrones came into the picture, television was considered the poorer cousin of cinema. All your large budget extravaganzas happened in films. But this show changed all of that. Now the makers of the show had to deal with a unique challenge in the sense that the source material was unknown to everybody. If you look at other fantasy series like The Lord of the Rings or the Harry Potter movies, you know exactly what is going to happen because you've read the books. Here, the makers had to constantly branch out and go beyond the source material. For the first time, millions of fans were creating their own theories and piecing together puzzles. It was a fantasy show, but it operated like a reality show. Also, the makers had to operate in the generation of social media, where everybody has a voice and criticism can be loud and heartbreaking. They also had to deal with their scripts being leaked. There was also piracy where episodes were illegally released. The makers had to constantly be 2 steps ahead of the audience. Where the show succeeded primarily is in taking an entire generation that had grown up on Harry Potter and they were now ready for something more realistic and less moralistic. In terms of filmmaking, the show set new benchmarks. The casting has been spot on and some of the performances were sublime, especially Tyrion, Cersei and Joffrey. Their performances were so realistic that I think they were some of the finest performances on television. Special credit needs to go to Ramin Djawadi, who has given terrific music throughout the show. If you can, please listen to the music and you will be transported back to specific scenes in the show. The show's biggest achievement is that in an age of diminishing attention spans, they managed a retail loyal audience for a decade. That in itself is quite the achievement. That brings us to the end of this episode and also to the end of this series called Game of Theories. If you've been watching this series from the first episode, I would like to personally apologize for the first few episodes. By the time I got a hang of the format for these videos, the series had ended. So there wasn't much I could do. If you think there was any point that I missed out, please let me know in the comment section and we can take the discussion there. If you're worried about your Hotstar subscription and what to do with it, then you can start watching Barry, which is another great series. Or you can watch a ton of other film companion videos on Hotstar. Like the last season of this series, I am going to end on a predictable cliche, and thus my watch has ended.